There are houses that guard their secrets the way soil guards the bones beneath it. Pressed deep, held under pressure, quiet for years, sometimes for generations, and then, one day, something shifts, not always with violence, not with fire, or shouting, or shattered glass. Sometimes it begins with the soft complaint of aging timber in the cold, sometimes with a faint hollow note beneath a passing heel, an emptiness where there should be solidity. Sometimes it is nothing more than a narrow thread of light slipping through a seam that should not exist, a pale line tracing the grain of the wood, like an old scar reopened. That is how it started in the Harwick house. Not with thunder, not with spectacle, with a seam of light beneath the dining room floor, beneath the place where meals had been shared. For decades, where children had grown and elders had been mourned, where prayers were spoken and wine was poured, and ordinary life moved forward without suspicion, lay something no one had imagined. What rested there did not merely disturb the present. It altered the meaning of every dinner, every blessing, every family story the Harwicks had ever told. This is not folklore polished by retelling. It is not a mountain legend shaped by exaggeration. What follows is drawn from coroners' ledgers, county court filings, the private journal of a woman who uncovered the truth too late, and the sworn testimony of a man who spent his final years ensuring that what happened in that house in Harlan County, Kentucky, in 1887 would not be forgotten. Every detail matters. Harlan County lies in the southeastern corner of Kentucky, pressed tight against the Virginia border by the steep ridges of the Cumberland Mountains. The valleys between those ridges are narrow and shadowed. Even in midsummer, sunlight reaches them only briefly. It is a landscape that feels less protective than observant, heavy, enclosed, watchful. The mountains do not shield, they witness. In 1887, the settlement that would later become the town of Loyal, formally incorporated in 1912, was little more than a scattering of structures along Martin's Fork Creek, a general store, a Methodist church, a grain mill, a blacksmith shop, and perhaps 40 households within walking distance of one another. The railroad had not yet cut through the hills. The coal companies had not yet arrived, though they were on their way. Within a decade, they would change everything, bring noise, laborers, machinery, and ambition. But in 1887, the county still carried the quiet of isolation. The Harwick property stood on a low rise roughly a mile and a half north of the settlement. A rutted wagon path followed the creek before climbing a short embankment into a broad, uneven yard. By local standards, the house was substantial. 2 stories of hewn timber resting on a stone foundation, a covered front porch, a detached kitchen connected by a roofed walkway, a root cellar carved into the hillside 20 yards behind the house, and several aging-out buildings. The structure had been built in stages. The original single-room cabin dated to the 1830s. A larger addition, including the dining room, was completed in the 1850s. According to a deed filed in 1850s, 3 families had owned the property before the Harwicks. A man named Dunar built the first structure and farmed the creek bottom before selling in 1841 to the Slagle family. The Slagles expanded the outbuildings and added the kitchen passageway, holding the land for 15 years before selling it in the spring of 1856 to Cord Harwick. Cord Harwick was 41 at the time of purchase. He had come from neighboring Letcher County, where he had briefly operated a small tannery. A dispute with a business partner, its details never publicly recorded, had stirred enough local talk that he chose to leave Whitesburg behind and begin again elsewhere. He arrived in Harlan County with a wagon, his wife Eleanor, 3 children, between 6 and 12, and a reputation defined more by absence than scandal. In a place where most men were tethered to long family histories, Cord carried none. He was a man without a county story. Eleanor Harwick was described as capable and deliberate, plain-spoken, efficient, neither overly social nor unfriendly. She managed the household with steady discipline, tended a kitchen garden, preserved her own vegetables, and attended Methodist services with consistency rather than fervor. Neighbors sometimes called her reserved, but it seemed less shyness than intention. She observed, she listened, she missed little. Their children were Walter 12, Daniel 9, and Nora 6, when they settled on the ridge. By 1887, 3 decades had reshaped the family. Walter, now 43, was married with children and living in Bell County. Daniel had died of fever in 1872 at 24. Nora, now Nora Harwick Pruitt, wife of George Pruitt, lived 6 miles from the old property. Cord Harwick died in the winter of 1881 at 66. The county physician listed the cause as congestion of the lungs. Eleanor buried him in a small family plot at the edge of the land and paid a local man in Loyal to carve the stone. Then she remained in the house alone. In the spring of 1887, she was 72 years old. She had lived under that roof for 31 years and had never suspected that the dining room floor concealed anything unusual. It began in March. Eleanor rose before dawn, as she always had. Habit guided her through the house, in the half-light. She built the kitchen fire, set water to boil, and crossed the covered passage toward the dining room to retrieve a crock of dried beans she had left on the sideboard the night before. As she stepped across the center of the floor, she heard it, a hollow tone, not quite a knock, not quite an echo, rising faintly from beneath her right foot. She paused, took a step back, stepped forward again. The sound returned. It was subtle, but it was wrong. The sound returned, unmistakable this time. A faint but definite hollowness that did not match the solid, close-grained sound the rest of the floor produced. She stood on that spot for a long moment, pressing her weight down, listening. It was not the sound of a settling foundation. Eleanor had lived in old houses long enough to know what settling sounded like. This was different. This was the sound of empty space beneath pressure. The sound of something that was hollow because it was built to be hollow, not because it had decayed or shifted. She got down on her hands and knees. The floorboards in the dining room were wide-cut oak planks, dark with age and years of cleaning, fitted together so closely that in most sections it would have been difficult to slide a knife blade between them. But when Eleanor bent close to the section that had produced the hollow sound, she noticed something she had never noticed before, though she would have said afterward that she could not understand how she had failed to notice it, because once seen it seemed utterly obvious. The grain pattern of the boards in that central section was not continuous with the grain of the boards on either side of it. They were the same wood, the same width, the same width, the same color, stained by decades of the same cleaning cloth, and the same oil and the same kitchen smoke. But the grain ran differently. In the boards that bordered the section, the grain curved and stretched in the long, flowing arcs of planks cut from old-growth timber, full of character and variation. In the central sect, iron, approximately 4 3 feet. She would later estimate the grain was straighter, tighter, more uniform, like boards that had been cut from a different tree, or boards that had been cut for a different purpose and placed here to match as closely as possible what surrounded them. She pressed her fingers along the edges of the section. The gap between the central boards and the surrounding floor was so fine as to be almost invisible, but it was there, a hairline separation running on all 4 sides. A door. Eleanor Harwick was kneeling on the floor of her dining room in a house she had lived in for 31 years, and she was looking at a door built into the floor that she had never known existed. She sat back on her heels for a very long time, and then she stood up, walked out of the room, walked out of the house, walked the 6 miles to her daughter's home, and did not say a word about what she had found until she got there. George Pute was a practical man, a builder by trade, competent and methodical, not given to flights of imagination or dramatic interpretations of ordinary events. He was 39 years old in 1887, 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, with the careful hands of a man who worked with timber and knew what it was capable of. He had been married to Nora for 14 years. He liked his mother-in-law. He thought she was sensible, and he trusted her judgment. When Elelena arrived at their door and told him that she had found something unusual under the dining room floor, George did not ask many questions. He put on his coat. They arrived at the Harwick house in the early afternoon, George and Nora together. There, George carried his tool bag, which he had brought out of professional habit. If there was a floor panel that needed lifting, he would need the right tools to do it without damaging the surrounding boards. In the dining room, Elelenana showed him the section. George got on his knees, ran his hands across it the same way she had, pressed down, listened to the hollow return. Then he took a thin-bladed tool from his bag, worked it carefully along the edge of the section, and confirmed what Elelena had already found. The separation was clean and precise. This was not a gap caused by shrinkage or poor joinery. It was a manufactured joint built to hold close. He worked methodically, clearing the gap on all 4 sides, testing with his fingers for any locking mechanism, any peg or pin that might be holding it in place. He found nothing on the north side, nothing on the east, on the south. Near the center of that edge, his finger pressed against something that gave a small recessed tab built into the underside of the panel, invisible from above. Without probing, he pressed it. The panel shifted. Not much, perhaps a 1/4 inch, but enough to break the seal of the fit. George looked up at Nora and Elelena. Neither of them spoke. He gripped the edge of the panel with both hands and lifted. The panel was hinged on the north side. A pair of heavy iron hinges recessed, so deeply into the wood that they had been entirely invisible from above. It swung up and over, settling against the floor with a slow, controlled movement that told George immediately this was well-made joinery. The hinges had been designed to hold the weight of the panel without sagging, to swing it cleanly without binding, and to allow it to rest open without falling back. Beneath the panel was a framed opening. Perhaps 3 feet by 2.5 feet, with the framing mortised into the surrounding floor structure so solidly that it would have borne the full weight of a table and chairs placed directly on top of it without any deflection. And below the opening, dropping away into darkness, was a staircase, cut stone steps, narrow and steep, descending at a sharp angle into absolute blackness. The 3 of them knelt at the edge and looked down. The air that came up from below was cold and still, and carried with it a faint complex smell that none of them could immediately name. Old earth, certainly, and stone, and something else. Something that had no familiar category, something that settled at the back of the throat and stayed there. "How far does it go?" Nora asked. George got a candle from the kitchen. He held it at the opening and watched the flame. It bent slightly. There was a draft from below, barely perceptible, which meant the space at the bottom was connected to outside air somewhere. He counted the steps visible in the candle's reach. 7. And then darkness reach. 7. He looked at Elelena. "Did your husband ever mention anything about this?" Elena's expression was not what either of them expected. It was not surprise. It was not confusion. It was something harder to read than either of those things. She was looking at the opening in her floor with an expression that George Pruitt would later describe in his testimony before the Harland County Court as recognition without understanding. "No," she said quietly, "he never mentioned it." And then, after a moment, she said something else, something that George would repeat many times over the following weeks, and that would become one of the most frequently quoted lines in the county records related to this case. "But I think I know what it is. To understand what Eleanor believed she had found, and to understand why she believed it, it is necessary to step back from the house on the ridge and look at the broader landscape in which it existed. Harland County, Kentucky, sits in a peculiar geographic and historical position, surrounded by mountains that made large-scale plantation agriculture impossible. The county had never developed the kind of slave economy that defined the bluegrass region, and peculiar detail, of the central and western parts of the state. Farms in Harland County were small and self-sustaining. Slaveholding, while it existed, was limited. The 1850 census recorded fewer than 120 enslaved persons in the entire county, spread across perhaps 20 households, most of them holding 2 or 3 individuals rather than the dozens or hundreds that characterized the plantation counties to the north and west. This did not mean Harland County was without conflict around the question of slavery. The proximity to Virginia, the state line ran barely 15 miles east of Loyal, created a particular set of tensions that were different from those of the plantation regions, but no less significant. The mountains that isolated Harland County from the broader currents of state and national life also created a corridor. The ridgelines and creek valleys of the Cumberland Mountains had long been traveled by people moving without permission, people who had decided, at enormous personal risk, that the life they had been assigned was not the one they would accept. The route through Harland County was not one of the formally documented pathways of the Underground Railroad. Those more organized networks tended to run through the central and western portions of the state, through Louisville and Lexington, and the river crossings to the north. What passed through the southeastern mountains was something more informal, more improvised, more dependent on individual human decisions, made in darkness and silence. People in these mountains helped runaways not because they belonged to any organization, not because they received instructions or compensation, but because when a person appeared at their door in the night, hungry and afraid, some people opened the door and some people did not. The Harwick house sat on a ridge with long sight lines in 3 directions. It was 1.5 miles from the nearest settlement. It had a root cellar and multiple outbuildings. It sat along a route that, if a person were traveling north through the mountains on foot, would be a reasonable stopping point. What Eleanor had suspected for a very long time, and what she had never asked Court directly, and what Court had never told her, was that the man she had married had been at some point before their life together in Harland County involved in something that he had reason to conceal. Not a criminal matter precisely, not the sort of thing that left records in the ordinary sense, but a history, a buried one. She had pieced it together over 30 years from things that had no business fitting together as neatly as they did. A conversation she had overheard in the summer of 1858, when a man she did not recognize had arrived at the property after dark and left before dawn, and the expression on Court's face as he watched him leave. A passage in Court's personal journal, which she had found after his death, that referred to arrangements, and the lower passage in terms opaque to be clearly interpreted, but too specific to be entirely dismissed. The behavior of their dog, a large mixed hound named Barker, who had spent several nights in the late 1850s and early 1860s, stationed at the north end of the dining room, with an alertness that she had attributed at the time to something burrowing under the house. She had suspected something was there. She had not known its form, and now she did. George descended the stairs first with a lantern. He went slowly, placing his feet carefully on the cut stone steps, testing each one before committing his weight. The stairs were solid. The stone was dry and stable, the edges still sharp, showing no particular erosion. Someone had cut and laid them carefully, and whoever had done so had known what they were doing. There were 11 steps in total. George counted D as he descended. At the bottom, the lantern's light spread into a low ceiling chamber cut directly into the earth and stone of the ridge. The walls were shored with timber, old timber, dark with age, fitted against the stone with wooden wedges driven into the gaps to prevent collapse. The floor was bare earth, packed hard and smooth. The ceiling, supported by the same timber framework that lined the walls, was roughly 6 feet at its highest point, dropping slightly toward the back of the space. The chamber was approximately 12 feet long and 8 feet wide. It was not empty. Against the far wall, arranged with a care that was immediately apparent even to someone who did not yet understand what they were looking at, were several objects, a wooden pallet raised off the earth floor on 2 low runners, the kind of simple sleeping platform that could be constructed in an afternoon from rough lumber, an iron hook set into the wall, from which hung 2 folded wool blankets that had aged to the color of old tea. On the floor beneath the hook, a tin cup and a tin plate, their surfaces uniformly oxidized. A wooden box, low and flat, roughly the size of a small trunk, sitting against the east wall, with its lid closed, and in the corner nearest the stairs, pressed into the angle where the east wall met the south wall, as if placed there by someone who had thought carefully about where it would be most useful, a small iron stove, not more than 2 feet high, with a pipe that rose into the ceiling and disappeared, not through the floor of the dining room above, as George had half expected, but through the stone of the ridge wall itself, exiting, as George would determine after a later examination, at a point roughly 15 feet east of the house, where the chimney's outlet was concealed behind a dense thicket of rhododendron that had grown against the hillside over many years. George stood in the middle of the chamber and turned slowly, holding the lantern, and he understood what he was looking at. This was a room built for human habitation, built with intention and care, designed for concealment, equipped for extended occupation. The stove vented sideways through the mountain, rather than upward to prevent smoke from appearing above the house. The staircase was hidden beneath a floor panel designed to be invisible. The chamber itself was cut deep enough into the ridge that no sound from within would reach the surface. Someone had built this room so that people could live in it without anyone above or outside knowing they were there. He climbed back up the stairs. Nora and Eleanor were sitting at the dining room table. Neither of them had spoken since he went down. "There's a room," he said. "A proper room with a sleeping platform and a stove. The stove vents through the hill." Nora looked at her mother. Elelaniah was looking at the open panel in the floor. "How old is it?" Nora asked. "The timber's very old," George said. "The stove is cast iron. Could be 20, 30 years old. Could be older." He paused. "There are blankets still there." Elelana said nothing. George sat down. He placed the lantern on the table. He looked at his mother-in-law for a long time. "Mrs. Harwick," he said, "what do you know about this room?" Elelana looked up. Her eyes were clear and direct, the way they always were, but beneath the clarity there was something else. A tiredness, maybe, or a weight that had been carried for a very long time and was only now being set down. "I know it was there before we arrived," she said. "The room was there when Cord bought this house." The Slaggles built it, or had it built sometime in the 1840s. She paused. I believe it was used for what you think it was used for. And I believe it was used after we arrived as well, though Court never said so to me directly. Nora stared at her mother. Why didn't you ever ask him? Elelanana was quiet for a moment. Then because there are things you do not put into words, things that are safer as silence. I knew what the room was in the way you know, things you haven't been told. And I knew that, knowing it directly, having it spoken, having it become a conversation would put us all in danger. She folded her hands on the table. Those were different times you were children. George went back down. He needed to know what was in the box. Nora followed him this time, despite his mild objection. She descended carefully, holding the wall, and stood beside him in the low chamber while he crouched before the wooden box against the east wall. It wasn't locked. The lid was held by two simple iron clasps that had rusted to the color of dried blood, and George opened them with some effort. The metal stiff and reluctant, after years of cold and damp. Inside was a collection of objects arranged with evident care, not thrown in, not scattered, but placed as if someone had considered each item and chosen its position deliberately. On top lay a piece of folded oilcloth, which George lifted and set aside. Beneath it was a thin leather-bound book, roughly the size of a man's palm, its cover worn smooth at the edges, and the leather cracked along the spine. George opened it carefully. The pages were handwritten. The ink faded to a pale brown. The handwriting variable, sometimes neat and deliberate, sometimes cramped and rushed, as if written under different conditions at different times. It was a record of some kind. Dates, initials, directions, numbers that might have been distances, names of geographical features, creeks, ridges, the occasional settlement name, and at intervals what appeared to be simple shorthand notations, pairs of initials, sometimes a single word, sometimes nothing but a small mark that co. All'd have been a tick or a cross. George could not decipher most of it, not because the writing was illegible, but because whatever system the writer had used to record these things was not self-explanatory. It had not been written for any future reader. It had been written as a private aid memoir, intelligible only to someone who already knew what the entries referred to. Beneath the book was a small collection of folded papers, documents of various kinds. George opened each one carefully. The first was a torn half sheet of paper on which someone had drawn a rough map, showing a trail through what appeared to be mountain terrain, with compass directions marked, and 2 or 3 landmarks notated in A. Handwriting that did not match the journals. The map had been handled many times. The fold lines were deep and soft, the edges worn. The second was a fragment of a letter, the top half missing, beginning mid-sentence. And if you find yourself unable to proceed before the weather turns, the lower room will hold 2 comfortably for as long as required. The stove can be vented without showing. You will find everything necessary. God keep you safe. There was no signature. The paper was water-stained and brittle. The handwriting was that of an educated person. The letters formed carefully. The language chosen with deliberation. The third document was the one that stopped both George and Nora cold. It was a complete letter on better quality paper than the others, dated April 14th, 1857, addressed to no named individual, but beginning with the salutation to whoever uses this place after me. The handwriting was precise and unhurried, the ink darker than the other documents, suggesting it had been written more recently than the rest. George read it aloud, slowly in the lantern light, to whoever uses this place after me. I do not know your name, and you do not know mine. That is, as I, T, should be. The less we know of one another, the safer we are. But I have found myself unable to leave this place without writing something, without leaving some record that this room existed and what it was used for. Even if that record is never read by anyone who was not already present here. This room was built in the year 1847 by a man whose name I will not write. He built it for the purpose, you understand. In the years between its building and the present writing, it has been used 7 times to my knowledge. Those people do not need their history written in a document that can be found. They carried their own histories. They took them north with them, where they belong. I will say this only. The room served. It served 11 people over 6 years, of which 2 I knew had arrived safely where they meant to go, and the rest I could only pray for. 11 people. That is a number I will carry to my death. The room is still there. I do not know what I will do with it in the end. Some things are meant to remain. Crane set the journal on his desk and sat with it for a long time. Then he went to find Walter Harwick. Rufus's boy came to see me last autumn about a matter he would not state plainly. That line from Court Harwick's journal became the axis around which the investigation turned. Crane had already noted in his visit to Clarence Slagle what he described as credibility of denial uncertain. He had a man who had come to the Harwick property, perhaps in 1862 or 1863, based on Court's timeline, asking about something he would not state plainly, a man who had grown up on that same property, whose father had owned it during the period when the room was first built. A man who, when asked directly, claimed to have no knowledge of the room's existence. If Clarence had visited Court Harwick in 1862 or 1863, which would have made Clarence approximately 37 or 38 years old at the time, and if his purpose had been what Court's dismissal suggested, then the question was, why? By 1862, the Civil War was in its 2nd year. The question of slavery, which had been a matter of political and moral argument for decades, was now also a matter of artillery fire and military mobilization. Harland County, like much of the mountains south, was deeply divided, not along the neat geographic lines that later memory would assign to the conflict, but within communities and sometimes within families. Some men from the county had gone south to join Confederate forces. Others had joined the Union. Many had done neither, attempting to maintain a neutrality that the war made increasingly untenable. The room beneath the Harwick dining room had been built to serve people moving north. The question of whether it had continued to serve that purpose after 1861, and if so, under what circumstances, was both morally and legally complex, in ways that the pre-war situation had not been. What had Clarence Slagle wanted from Court Harwick in the autumn of that wartime year? Crane thought about this for a long time before deciding on an approach. He went back to Clarence Slagle. This time he brought Frederick Patton. He brought the excerpt from Court's journal that he had copied out by hand, not the original, which he had secured as evidence, but a precise transcription. He sat in Clarence's parlor in the same chair as before, and he read the excerpt aloud. Clarence listened without expression. The journal identifies you as the person who visited Court Harwick in the autumn of 1862 or 1863 and inquired about a matter you would not state plainly. Crane said, Court Harwick believed you were asking about the room. He told you he did not know what you were speaking of. Clarence said, I have no recollection of any such visit. Do you have no recollection, Crane said carefully, or are you telling me it didn't happen? A silence. Those are different things, Crane said. Clarence Slagle looked at the sheriff of Harland County for a long moment. He was 61 years old, a man of substance and standing, a man who had spent his entire adult life building a reputation that he had reason to value. He had a wife, grown children, a practice, a name that meant something in this county. He also, Crane suspected, Had a history. Not a criminal one precisely. Not a criminal one precisely. Not one that would hold up in any court of 1887, but a personal history. A history of choices made and silences kept. That was quite a bit more complicated than the public man in the parlor would have wished it to be. "What is it you want from me?" Clarence said. His voice was still level, still controlled, but the performance had dropped away. He was simply asking a direct question. "The truth," Crane said. "As much of it as you know. Not for the purpose of prosecution. There's nothing to prosecute. The war has been over for 20 years, and the law has changed in every direction that matters. I want the truth, because there is a history in those 2 rooms that deserves to be understood completely, and you are one of the few people still living who might actually be able to provide the pieces I don't have." Clarence looked out the window. A long silence. His hands folded on his knee did not move. "My father built that room," he said. "I was 14 years old. I helped carry the timber down. I thought we were building a second cellar for dry storage." He paused. "He told me the truth 3 years later. I was 17. He took me down and explained what the room was, and what it had been used for, and why." He paused again. "My father was a complicated man. He was in many ways a man of his time, which is to say that there were things he accepted without question that I now know were wrong. But the room was a thing he had done with high, full conscience, and he was not ashamed of it. Did he ever tell you how many people had used it?" He said 17 over 7 years, but he said that number carefully. He was uncertain about several of them. 17. The same number in the letter in the box. And when you went to see Court Harwick, Crane said, Clarence was quiet for a moment. My father had died the year before, 1861. I had known when the house was sold to Harwick in 56 that the room was still there. I didn't know Harwick's sympathies. In 62, when the war had been running for a year and the situation in the mountains was complicated, I wanted to know if the room was still being used, not to stop it. I wanted to know if it was still being used because I had information about routes, about contacts, that might be useful to anyone using it. He stopped. Herrick didn't trust me. I can't say I blame him. I was Slagle's son, and I was a lawyer, and there was no reason on earth for him to take my word for anything. He told me he didn't know what I was talking about and showed me the door. And after that, nothing. The war ended. Everything changed. He looked back at Crane. There was a child, he said. Crane was still in the second room, Clarence said. The one at the end of the tunnel. In 1849, when I was 23, a woman and a child. The child was very young, 2 years old, perhaps. The woman had carried the child the whole way from Carter County, Virginia, almost 90 miles. She arrived at our property in the middle of a cold October night. He stopped. The child died, he said, 3 days into the stay, the cold and the exhaustion of the journey. The woman, I don't know her name. My father never told me her name. She stayed for another 2 days, and then she went north. My father buried the child in the second room. He didn't mark it above ground, because he couldn't risk anyone finding it and asking questions. He put a cross, and the chick ilds things down there, and he pressed the earth over them, and that was the burial. George put it in his second descent to the small room at the end of the tunnel, had found shoes, a nightcap, a cross bound with twine. He had put them back exactly as he found them. Do you know if the woman survived? Crane asked. No, Clarence said. My father never found out. He looked for years. He never found out. The letter in the box to whoever uses this place after me had been dated April 14th, 1857. The Slagles had sold the property to Court Harwick in the spring of 1856. The letter had been written a year after the property changed hands. which meant it had not been written by Rufus Slagle. He had already sold the house. He would not have had access to the room after the sale. Crane had noted this discrepancy from the beginning, but had held it in reserve, waiting for the investigation to produce a candidate. When he read the letter again after his second conversation with Clarence, he noticed something he had not noticed before, or rather had noticed, but not yet processed. The handwriting. He had in his possession, at this point, 3 documents in the same hand: the journal from the box, the aid memoir of routes and initials and compass directions, the fragment of a letter beginning, "And if you find yourself unable to proceed before the weather turns," and the complete letter addressed to whoever uses this place after me. The same person had written all 3, and that person had not been Rufus Slagle, because Crane had found a deed signed by Rufus Slagle in the county records, and the handwriting did not match. The handwriting was that of an educated person. The language was that of an educated person. May God grant mercy to everyone who has ever sheltered in this darkness, and to everyone who made the choice to keep the light on for them. That was not the language of a farmer. It was the language of someone who had been trained in careful expression. Crane asked Clarence Slagle if his father had ever had an associate, a partner, a confidant, anyone who had knowledge of the room and was closely connected to the property. Clarence thought for a long time. Then there was a man, a minister. He served the area around Loyal from about 1845 to maybe 1858. His name was Alden Price. Welsh family from somewhere in Western Virginia originally. He was educated, studied theology somewhere, I believe, though he was never ordained in any formal denomination. He called himself simply a minister. Clarence paused. He was a friend of my father's. He visited the property many times. He knew about the room. Crane found the handwriting of Alden Price in the archives of the Methodist congregation at Loyal. The minutes of several meetings written in the minister's hand during his tenure. The handwriting matched the documents from the box precisely. Alden Price had kept the record of the room's uses. Alden Price had written the letter. Alden Price had been the person who knew the routes, who knew the contacts, who had managed the practical realities of what Rufus Slagle had built, and others had used, and Alden Price had left the county in 1857, and according to every record Crane could find, had not returned. The aid memoir from the box, the small leather-bound journal of routes and initials, turned out to be more legible than it had initially appeared. It required a key, which Crane eventually worked out with Walter Harwick's assistance over the course of several evenings, and once deciphered, it produced a meticulous record. 17 people over 7 years, from 1847 to 1854. The entries were brief: a date, a tear, a set of initials, a direction of travel, and occasionally a note. Arrived well or continued 2 days, or in 3 cases. A small mark that Crane and Walter agree. Detail, Dow, after long consideration, almost certainly indicated uncertainty about outcome. 17 people, men and women, and in at least 2 cases, one of them being the child whose cross still lay in the earth of the second room, children from Virginia, most of them based on the directional notations, moving north toward the river crossings in central and northern Kentucky, and from there toward Ohio, toward Indiana, toward whatever form of continued life they could build beyond the reach of the laws that had claimed ownership of them. Crane could not identify any of the 17 from the initials alone. There was no cross-reference, no additional documentation, no way to know which of the 17, if any, had arrived where they were going. He wrote to contacts in several Ohio and Indiana counties, describing what he had found, and asking if any local record showed persons of this approximate timing and origin who had settled in those areas. He received over the following months two responses of cautious interest, one from a Clary in Athens County, Ohio, one from a minister in Shelby County, Indiana. But neither could be definitively connected to the Harland County room. The 9 safe arrivals that the letter mentioned, I have confirmed. 9 safe arrivals remained unconfirmable. What could be confirmed, and what Crane documented with considerable care, was the physical record. The room, the tunnel, the second room, the sleeping platform, the stove and its concealed ventilation, the wooden box and its contents, the cross in the earth. He wrote it all down in the official log of Harland County, in the clear and methodical prose of a man who understood that the record itself was a form of obligation. The deposition he took from Eleanor Herrick, her formal statement regarding what she had suspected and when, and the distinction she made between suspecting and knowing, was written into the same record. The deposition from Clarence Slagle, who came to the office voluntarily and dictated a full account of what his father had told him and what he himself knew. The transcriptions from Court Harwick's journal, the authenticated handwriting comparison, establishing Alden Price as the author of the documents in the box. It was the most complete account anyone could produce 30 years after the fact of a small, informal station in the mountain roots of the pre-war South. It did not account for everything. It could not name the 17. It could not confirm the 9. It could not find Alden Price, or determine where he had gone in 1857, or what had happened to him afterward. But it established what had happened in that house, and it established what had happened in that house, and it established, and this was the detail that Crane returned to more than any other in the years after he closed the formal investigation, that it had been done in silence, not in organization, not with official sanction, not with recognition, in silence, in the cold, in the dark, by ordinary people who had decided to open a door. The investigation concluded formally in August of 1887, 5 months after George Pwitt lifted the floor panel in the dining room. Crane's official record ran to 37 handwritten pages. He filed it with the county court, made a copy for his own archive, and provided Eleanor Harwick with a summary. Eleanor read the summary at the kitchen table with Nora beside her on a warm afternoon in late August, with the windows open and the sound of the creek audible from below the ridge. She read it without commenting, turning the pages carefully, her face controlled in the way it always was. When she finished, she folded it neatly and set it on the table. 31 years, she said, and I ate my meals above that room for 31 years. Nora looked at her. Does that disturb you? Eleanor thought about it. A real consideration, not a deflection. No, she said finally, it does not disturb me. What disturbs me is that I didn't know. What disturbs me is that I didn't know. What disturbs me is that court couldn't tell me. She paused. He didn't tell me because he didn't trust that I would understand what it meant, or perhaps because he thought the knowing would be a burden for me. Either way, he carried it alone for 30 years, and now he is dead, and the people in those rooms are gone. And the only one left to account for any of it is an old woman who didn't know. You suspected, Nora said. Suspecting is not knowing, Eleanor said. She was quiet for a long moment. The child in the second room, she said. The child buried in the earth at the end of that tunnel. That child has been under my house for 40 years. Neither of them spoke. I want a proper burial, Eleanor said. Whatever can be done, I want that child given a proper burial. She looked at Nora. Will George arrange it? Yes, Nora said. He will. George Pritt, in consultation with the Methodist minister in Loyal and with the agreement of Sheriff Crane, arranged a small private ceremony in the family burial plot at the edge of the Harwick property. The remains, fragmentary after 40 years in the earth, were moved with care and reinterred with a marker. The marker did not bear a name because no name was known. It bore only a date, approximately 1849, and a small cross, echoing the one that had been found in the second room. Elena attended. Nora and George attended. Sheriff Crane attended. Clarence Slagle, who had learned of the arrangement through Crane, attended as well, standing apart at a slight distance, his hat in his hands, saying nothing. It was a quiet ceremony, as it had to be. The congregation was small, and the grave was small, and the day was overcast. The kind of Kentucky late summer day that carries in it the first cold breath of the coming autumn. The minister said what ministers say when they bury the plus, unknown. A prayer for the soul, a prayer for peace, a hope that the journey home was short. Elena stood at the grave for a long time after the others had moved back. Then she went inside and made supper, and the ridge above Martins's Fork Creek was quiet as the evening came on. Elena Harwick continued to live in the house on the ridge for 4 more years, until her death in the spring of 1891, at the age of 76. She died in her own bed in the room she had shared with Court Harwick for decades, with Nora beside her. The panel in the dining room floor had been left intact. George had resealed it after the investigation, precisely as it had been. The pin latch, the hinges, the invisible join. It could be opened. It still could be opened. But Elena had made clear that she did not want it altered, or covered, or removed. It was built for a purpose, she said to Nora in one of the conversations they had in the months after the investigation ended. It served that purpose. It should stay as it is. She ate her meals above it for 4 more years, now knowing what it was, now knowing the names, not of the 17 who had sheltered there, but of the men who had built and maintained it, the minister who had kept its record, the woman who had arrived in October, with a child too small to survive the journey. She ate her meals above all of it, and the knowing, she said, changed things. Not in the dramatic way that secrets revealed in stories tend to change things, not as revelation or rupture, but in the quiet way that truth changes the texture of ordinary life. The same table, the same chairs, the same creak sound from below the ridge. But underneath a room, a record, a small grave at the edge of the property. I think about them, she told Nora once. Not at particular times, just I think about them. The way you think about people you never met, but whose existence has touched your cess. I think about the woman who left her child in that earth and went north. I wonder if she made it. I wonder if she thought about that room for the rest of her life. She was quiet for a moment. I think she did, she said. I think some rooms stay with you forever. When Nora Puit inherited the property, after Eleanor's death in 1891, she and George debated what to do with it. The house was old and would require significant maintenance. The farm had not been actively worked for years. They had their own property 6 miles away, but neither of them could bring themselves to sell it. They rented it instead to a family named Hensley, who lived in it for 12 years, without ever learning about the panel in the dining room floor. George had sealed it thoroughly before the Hensleys moved in, and had placed a heavy sideboard over the section, not to hide it exactly, but to give it protection. When the Hensley family left in 1903, Nora had the panel opened and inspected. Everything below was as it had been. Below was as it had been. The sleeping platform, the iron stove, the box now emptied of the documents which were in Crane's archive, the wool blankets still folded on their hook, 20 years older and more fragile, the tunnel to the second room with the small cross still in the earth where George had replaced it. She sealed it again. She placed a new marker at the grave in the family plot, replacing the original stone that had weathered. Sheriff Aldous Crane died in 1899 after serving as Harlan County Sheriff for 23 years. The record he had compiled, 37 handwritten pages, with the full accounts, the depositions, the handwriting comparisons, passed into the county court archive, where it remained. His deputy, Frederick Patton, who by 1899 had become the county clerk, ensured that the record was preserved and properly filed. Walter Harwick, who had brought his father's journal from Bell County and had participated, detail. The investigation, wrote his own account of the discovery in 1895, a decade after the fact. It was not published. He wrote it for himself, he said, and for his children, who were by then grown and had asked him about the room that their grandmother had told them about in her final years. The account ran to 40 pages, written in the careful, precise hand of a mill operator who understood the value of accurate records. Walter's account included a detail that none of the official documents had captured: his own recollection of a conversation with his father, Court Harwick, in the late summer of 1878, 3 years before Court's death. Walter had been 34 years old. He had come to visit his parents and had spent several days at the house. One evening, sitting on the porch, after supper with his father while Elena was inside, Court had said something that Walter had not fully understood at the time. "I built a good house," Court had said. "It was good before I got here. I kept it good. That's all any man can do." Walter had not known then what his father meant. He had thought Court was talking about carpentry or farming, or the ordinary kind of pride a man takes in a property well maintained. He knew what it meant now. It was good before I got here. I kept it good. 11 people had descended those stairs under Court Harwick's care and gone north, of the 2 whose arrivals he had confirmed. And from one, Walter had learned this from a contact in central Ohio, after years of quiet searching, had been a man named Charles, surname unknown, who had worked as a blacksmith in a small town in Greene County, Ohio. For the remainder of his life, he had died in 1879, 8 years before the floor panel was discovered, married with 4 children. His death notice in the local paper described him as a man of great dignity and good humor, much beloved by those who knew him. That was all Walter had found. One day, me, partial, one life, partial. Out of 11, he wrote, I do not know what happened to the other 10. I believe my father did not know either. The uncertainty seemed to be something he accepted, not peacefully exactly, but with the recognition that some things cannot be resolved. He helped. He kept the secret. He did not know for most of his life whether the helping had mattered. He kept it good anyway. I think that is the only kind of courage that actually exists. Not the kind where you know the outcome, the kind where you don't. The Harwick property passed out of the family's possession in 1911, when George Pwitt, in his early 60s, and in declining health, made the decision to sell. By that time the railroad had arrived in Harlan County, and the coal companies with it and the county had changed in ways that none of the people who had lived through the discovery of 1887 could entirely have anticipated. The mountains were being cut open. The valleys were filling with noise. A region once shaped by distance and self-reliance was yielding to something louder, more connected, and far less gentle. The buyer who acquired the Harwick Ridge was not a farmer, nor a neighbor expanding his fields, but a representative of a mining company. He purchased the property along with several surrounding tracts as part of a broad acquisition that would redraw the landscape. The house did not survive the change. It was dismantled to clear the way for a service road. The outbuildings were taken down. The root cellar carved into the hillside was collapsed and buried. What had stood for decades disappeared in a season. The family burial ground, however, remained. Cord Harriver, Eleanor Harwick, and the small grave once unmarked, later given a stone. The plot lay just beyond the operational boundary of the mining company's claim. It was spared. A fence was raised around it. For years the fence stood. Eventually it did not. When the house came down, the dining room floor went with it. The loose panel, the hidden seam, the staircase of cut stone. But what lay beneath may still remain: the chamber carved into the ridge, the timbered ceiling, the packed earth floor. Those were below the level of demolition, beneath whatever surface now covers that ground. Beneath more than a century of dust, industry, and seasons, the hollow space may still exist. And the tunnel, 40 feet east through the mountain, ending in the small earthen room where a child was buried in the autumn of 1849. Removing the structure above does not erase what was built below. The official record endured in the Harlan County Court archives. The file survived because Frederick Patton ensured it did. When the county reorganized its documents in the early 20th century, the papers were preserved rather than discarded. Aldous Crane's 37 handwritten pages remained intact. So did the transcriptions from Claude Harwick's journal, the depositions of Eleanor Harwick and Clarence Slagle, the handwriting analysis concerning Alden Price in Bell County. Among the personal papers donated by the Harwick family in 1924. 1 year after Walter Harwick's death, there rests another account, 40 pages written in 1895, in Walter's careful, deliberate script, a mill operator's hand, precise, methodical, a man who understood the permanence of ink. Alden Price was never located. Whatever drew him away from Harlan County in 1857 left no trace that investigators, then or later, were able to follow. The routes he sketched in his small leather journal ran across mountains that have since been transformed. The creeks remain, but the paths have shifted. Farms gave way to mines and logging roads. Later, some of that industry faded, and vegetation slowly reclaimed abandoned ground. The woman who carried her child, 9, miles through those mountains in October of 1849, remains unnamed. She passed through the hidden room and continued north. After that, she vanished from documentation into whatever life she managed to build, or failed to build, beyond recorded history. Her child was buried in Kentucky. She was somewhere else. 17 people moved through that chamber over time. 9 are confirmed to have reached safety. One partial name surfaced decades later in an Ohio county death notice, a man described as dignified, warm, beloved by those who knew him. And beneath a dining room floor for 31 years unknown to the woman who dined above it, there had been a staircase, 11 stone steps descending into darkness. It was not built for mystery's sake, not constructed to entertain secrecy. It existed for a reason as old as fear and compassion. There were people who needed concealment, and someone chose to provide it. The floor panel was lifted in the spring of 1887. The stairs led down into a low-ceilinged room, framed in timber and packed earth. The space was orderly. The stove was cold. Blankets remained neatly folded on their hooks. The tunnel stretched eastward, 40 feet through solid mountain. At its end lay the small chamber no one had entered for 3 decades. In its earth stood a simple cross bound tightly with twine. It had been tied with care, the kind of care that suggests the tying itself